particularly parents, I really spend a lot of time on this notion that behavior is a function of its consequences. Now, that can be sometimes very jarring to parents and others if they are used to the traditional older ways of, I don't mean to disparage anybody by saying that, but more classical ways of looking at behavior, that in fact behavior is a result of something that happened years and years and years ago, and it's kind of a crystallized problem buried deep in the id somewhere, and all the behavior afterward is a direct result of that. And parents sometimes are really kind of thrown aback when I say, well, we're not really concerned with what happened a long time ago. We're concerned really with what happened now, particularly with what happened right after that child did what they did. That's key. And I spend a lot of time teaching parents that very idea. And once they get that, it makes a great difference in terms of how they handle the child and how they're able to participate in setting up the contingencies so that their behavior is more likely to go in this direction rather than that direction. If you think about the oppositional child, their key defining characteristic is noncompliance. Well, what does noncompliance mean? Parent gives a direction and they do something else. They don't follow the direction. But the reason they don't follow the direction, and I get parents to try to understand that, is that there is something that happens after that behavior that makes it more likely that that child is going to ignore your directions. And most likely what happens, and I've seen this 100 times, is that the parent gives a direction, the child doesn't do it. The parent gives a direction, the child doesn't do it. The parent gives a direction, the child doesn't do it. So what does the child learn? They don't have to do it. So if the parent can understand that that consequence that follows that behavior is critical, it makes your life a lot easier. Now, classical conditioning, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but that basically reflects the kind of learning that takes place almost at the subconscious level with respect to the autonomic nervous system. So we're all victims of it. If you have a little bit of a phobia about something, it's more likely because of some classical conditioning paradigm here, where something that's relatively innocuous, like an elevator, becomes associated with a feared stimulus, a cue, and then just thinking about the elevator generates all this anxiety, and the anxiety gets conditioned to the elevator, and there you go, you got a phobia. Those two methods, operant conditioning and classical conditioning, are critical in trying to understand particularly anxious behavior. It's tough sometimes to figure out the relative contribution of both of these learning theories, but it's really important to at least understand how operant conditioning may work and to consider the fact that some of the behavior is also classically conditioned. Also, another way a child learns behavior, both adaptive and maladaptive, is via what is known as social learning principles. Now, these were developed by Albert Bandura, who I think is brilliant. And if you really want to get a good handle on this, I would refer you to some of his seminal works that were in the late 60s and early 70s. But the key things that I take away from his work is his emphasis on how a child learns by observing others, by imitating others, and by modeling. I spent a lot of time teaching parents this, that a child's behavior can be acquired by virtue of them observing a model. Very, very critical. The lying example I referred to earlier. The child may have observed the parent do something as innocuous as take a phone call from an insurance agent and say, oh, she's not here right now. Can I take a message? Well, the mother's standing right there and she says she's not here. The child hears, oh, she's lying. Oh, I guess I can lie. Okay? Modeling. Watching peers. Aggressive peers, let's say, and in the case of an aggressive child. If there is some aggressive act that the one child does against another, and then the peers that are around that aggressive child give them some sort of support, reinforcement, pat on the back, laughs, whatever, that child as the observer, witnesses something going on there that could be a potential source of reinforcement. Hey, you get aggressive and you get all these kids around you to say nice things about you. Modeling is extremely important with younger kids. Younger children, particularly the 2, 3, 4-year-old toddlers, they have very immature systems. They're developing. They have an enormous task ahead of them. How do I get from point A in my life to point B? They don't think that way, but I mean, it's essentially that. They have to go from one stage to the next, from one moment to the next, from one day to the next. It's an overwhelming task for a developing organism. What's a good way to learn what to do? Model your parents. Now, assuming that, of course, you have a quote-unquote normal parent or parents, that can lead to a nice developmental trajectory toward a adaptive existence. Now, if you have a parent who is depressed, a parent who has substance abuse problems, marital issues, well, then that modeling makes it more likely that there are going to be some behaviors that are going to be learned that aren't going to be so adaptive for that particular child. So observation, imitation, and modeling is critical in understanding why kids do what they do. In CBT, it's extremely important, and it's almost a truism when you think about therapy in general, that context is incredibly important. The child's behavior here is really influenced by all that's going around that particular child, their environment. And the child affects the environment. So it's a kind of a bidirectional influence. And so I tell parents that when I'm working with them. That environment, your family system that you've created for this particular child, I'm sure has some bearing on why the child thinks and feels and acts the way they do. But it goes the other way, particularly with kids who have disruptive behavior disorders. You know, the snotty kid, the non-compliant child, the aggressive child. They are very difficult for parents to handle. Parents don't like that, and we're all basic organisms in certain ways. We don't like being stimulated in bad ways, in negative ways. We don't like that. It's aversive. And when you get a child that's constantly doing that to you, you develop certain patterns of behavior that help you deal with that particular child. Okay, so it's a bidirectional influence. And some of those things that the parent learns is not very functional, particularly with respect to oppositional defiant kids. There is a hypothesis developed by Patterson called the coercive hypothesis that explains a lot about the generation of oppositional behavior. And it goes something like this, and I've alluded to that earlier. Child's given a demand by the parent or direction, and the child doesn't respond. Parent starts yelling, "I want you to pick up your toys." Kid says, just does what they want to do. Parent yells again, "I told you to pick up your toys." It may be 5-10 minutes later, so that there's already that reinforcement of the time interval there where they don't have to do what they were told to do. Parent then picks up the volume, storms into the room, slams, "I told you to pick up these damn toys." Okay, so what has the child done in a way? They've actually taught the parent coercion. And the child may respond in kind with, "I don't have to, leave me alone." And some parents will back off. Well, that's basically aversion relief. The parent's the aversive stimulus, and the child steps up his volume, becomes much more coercive, parent backs away. What has happened there? How likely is it this child is going to be non-compliant? It's up there. So Bandura put that as, or formulated that as using a construct called reciprocal determinism. So behavior is the product of an ever-changing interaction between person and environment. And I've sort of graphically illustrated a number of things that are important in assessing the context of a child. These things all need to be considered when you're working with kids, working with parents, working with the system. One may not think physiology is all that important, but it is. For example, let's take the anxious child. Kid's always fretful, always worried about things, always anticipating the worst. Well, when we look at kids like that in a more carefully controlled way, we find that not an insignificant number of them have a lowered physiologic threshold for threat sensitivity. Their system fires quickly when there's a stimulus out there that's kind of frightening or a little bit scary or something that they don't understand. Their system has that threshold problem where just biochemically, physiologically, they're much more prone to reacting with a threat response. So that's the physiology part of it. There's also genetics involved in that, of course. As many of you know, there's strong genetic contributions to any disorder, and more so as the disorder becomes more severe. And the physiology, of course, is heavily dependent on the genetics. And all that affects the anxious child's response to the environment. So in the interpersonal realm, they may have a high anxious parent themselves or a caregiver who is also threat sensitive. There's this one child that had a parent who talked about threat sensitivity in the parent. She told this child, who was about ready to fly to another destination to visit a relative, make sure you tie your shoes, because if there's a crash, your shoes won't fall off. My, is that a practical suggestion or what? But you can see what I'm talking about, is that parent has themselves a kind of threat sensitivity and the child picks that up. The cognitions in a child that you have to be concerned with have to do with the evaluation of danger and threat. So that's kind of what's on their mind. When they wake up in the morning, the first thing they think about, well, maybe I'm kind of characterizing that in a certain way, but not infrequently, they'll wake up thinking, God, what's going to happen now? Okay, they anticipate bad things happening to them. What emotion are they likely to have? Fear. So what do you do when you're full of fear? You do everything you can to make yourself comfortable. And one of the most reliable things that people do when they're afraid, kids particularly, they avoid the situation. So you can see in that circle of domains of importance how an anxious child's behavior is all related to that. And it's important as a therapist, a CBT therapist, that you understand that. All right, moving along, in CBT, learning is really more than just rewards and punishment. It may come as no surprise to you that we conceptualize learning also as being heavily dependent on how a child or an adolescent, parent, or other caregiver processes the information. That's a critical variable in working with children and adolescents with CBT. Children, adolescents, parents, all of us, me included, evaluate, judge, and categorize our behavior. We're constantly evaluating what's going on around us. All right, you're looking at your environment. It's a kind of a built-in mechanism that we have because we have what's called a volitional consciousness. So we have to constantly move it in the direction of promoting our survival. In order to do that, we have to constantly assess what's going on out there. Is that going to hurt me or not hurt me? Is it good for me or not good for me? It's a very primitive, fundamental level of existence, but we all have it. And we draw conclusions based on what happens to us. And as Friedberg and McClure indicate, kids active